November 2nd, 1975, and in the center of the clearing is a 5-acre pig pasture. The large grassy area clump of trees in the center of the clearing is a 5-acre pig pasture. The large grassy area at the top is the 40-acre cow pasture, which is planted in grass through this. That's the storage building there. The long row of black represents a windrow. That's trees that are on in our workshop. This thick group. Cow pasture, which is planted in grass. I would like to say at this time that all of this was made possible by our leader, Father Jones. Had it not been for him and the example he set.
Jeannie and Al Mills were supposed to be the two who made it out. By 1980, they finally felt they had their lives back, and after years of being surveilled, constantly moving, and receiving endless death threats, they were finally leaving their door unlocked again. Their kids finally stood a chance at living normal lives. It was a far cry from where they were back in 1969, when everything first went wrong. Jim Jones was a singularly magnetic, charismatic leader who wielded almost unmatched authority in Northern California in the late 60s and 70s. He had powerful friends all over the map, making him nearly untouchable. He found that by couching his communist politics in religious terms, it became palatable for the American public, and he presented to the world his idealistic vision of a diverse, egalitarian, socialist community that would provide and care for all of its members. And so his People's Temple was born in the mid-1950s, with a membership steadily climbing into the thousands in San Francisco by the 1970s. In time, Jones's lifelong Christ complex, relentless glad-handing, and his aptitude for psychological torment would make him an almost godlike figure within his church, utterly beyond reproach from the insiders who knew him, and sporting an unimpeachable record and image to the outside world. Those who tried to speak out against his physical, psychological, and sexual abuses risked not only death threats from his followers, but also social ostracization from the many celebrated figures in American society who called Jim Jones a friend. Jones was something of a favorite for many politicians in the early 70s, and he used that favored status to make himself untouchable. All the while, in the secrecy of his church, he was building a dangerously devoted cult that would follow him to any end. In the politics of San Francisco, California, and even the entire United States, Jim Jones was connected. It seemed almost impossible to escape Jim Jones and the People's Temple and get away with it. That's what made Jeannie and Al Mills so different. In 1969, Deanna and Elmer Myrtle first met Jim Jones. The Myrtles were both divorced, and together they had a mixed family of Elmer's 3 older children and Deanna's 2 younger children, Eddie and Delphine. Elmer liked Jones's message on racial integration, while Deanna liked that it offered a disciplined, drug-free community for her children. Within a few years, they'd both risen to the leadership of the People's Temple, and Deanna was responsible for organizing a lot of the funding. Over the years, Jones became more and more physically abusive, and in 1974, he brutally paddled their young daughter Delphine in front of hundreds of members of the temple, his typical method of punishment used on children. Years later, the Myrtles would describe that incident as the reason they left the temple, but they stayed for another year afterward. Finally, in 1975, they left, changing their names from Elmer and Deanna Myrtle to Al and Jeannie Mills, hoping that the name change would invalidate the documents that the People's Temple had forced them to sign. You see, to prevent members from leaving or betraying the group, everybody in the temple was forced to sign letters describing their activities as thieves, child molesters, adulterers, and more, all made up to provide the temple with blackmail material should they ever try to leave. After leaving the cult, Jeannie wrote a book called 6 Years with God, describing life during and after their time under Jim Jones. She recounted the abuses that Jones inflicted upon them, and their agonizing undertaking to leave the community they lived in for 6 years. Jeannie describes fearing for their lives at this time, as People's Temple members staked out their house, followed their kids to school, and left threatening letters on their doorstep. Their young children had lived the vast majority of their lives in a cult with few other children, and they were badly under-socialized. From 75 all the way through 78, they moved frequently, but they were always tracked down. Other defectors from the temple had been murdered, and they had every reason to fear that the same could happen to them. They founded an anti-cult organization called the Human Freedom Center, a halfway house for those leaving cults like the People's Temple, operating out of an old mental health facility in Berkeley. To help run their center, they obtained the services of a man named Lowell D. Stryker. Stryker was a political campaign consultant and mental health advisor. He met with the Mills in mid-1978 when Jeannie sought out his advice. At that time, Jim Jones and most of the People's Temple had fled to Guyana to set up a sort of paradise, free from intervention where nobody could get in or out. Jeannie and a group of concerned relatives of the 1,000 members of the church in Guyana had urged Congressman Lee O'Ryan from California's 11th District to go on a fact-finding mission to the so-called Jonestown to establish whether members were being held there against their will. Hearing about the expedition, Stryker felt he could be of some use as an expert in counseling cult members. He contacted Congressman Ryan's office to ask to join the mission, and though Ryan approved, Stryker was never notified that he'd been invited to join. In November of 1978, Congressman Ryan flew down with a few dozen concerned relatives of the cult members and found that many wanted to leave but were being forced to stay. As he attempted to fly out of Guyana with his report, his plane was attacked. He and over a dozen others were killed, but his plane managed to escape. Shortly afterward, Jim Jones ordered the entire People's Temple to commit mass suicide. 909 individuals died after drinking or being forced to drink poison Kool-Aid. In the media storm following the massacre, Jeannie took the opportunity to paint herself as the sympathetic victim of Jones' manipulation, completely under his spell and as a result innocent of any wrongdoing. But Stryker painted a very different picture of the Mills. While they could be warm and kind, they were also controlling and manipulative. Far from repenting from their crimes in the People's Temple, they mirrored those same practices in their own organization. In fact, they never really even decided to quit the temple. They left not after Jones beat their daughter, but after Jeannie failed in a power play attempt to kick Jim Jones upstairs. She and some other senior cult members tried to get Jones to retire to holy isolation and let them run the show, but Jones saw through it, and afterward he deprived her of the flow of funding she needed to feed her large family. For the Mills, it was partly a decision to leave and partly an ouster after a failed coup attempt. In the Human Freedom Center, Jeannie was operating similarly to Jones. She made a mission of painting herself as an anti-cult hero, but in so doing made herself just sort of a cult figure. She absolved herself of any of her misdeeds as a member of the People's Temple because she said Jones had her completely brainwashed, but to what extent is someone absolved of their responsibility for their action because of their participation in somebody else's delusion? Jeannie was a grown woman who had participated in swindling members of their family's money, blocking communications between members and relatives, and she allowed Jones to abuse her 2 young children. Yet she acted like she bore no responsibility for any of it. And when the Mills led the effort to send Congressman Ryan to expose Jonestown, they might have guessed what would happen. For years, Jones had hinted at a mass suicide and tested his followers' loyalty by giving them a cup of what he said was poison, then ordering them to drink it. The Mills must have known how desperate and on edge Jones had become, and that he'd hardly hesitate to kill them all, yet they still urged Ryan to go and expose the People's Temple. In the wake of it all, their young children, Eddie and Defection, were struggling badly to adjust as teenagers in the real world. In her early years, Defection became addicted to drugs and did sex work on the street to fund her addiction, while Eddie was extremely detached, withdrawn, and timid. After the cult's mass execution, the Mills did begin to feel safer. They had forecasted their own murder at the hands of Jones' hitmen for years, but now it seemed that the threat was gone. But their Human Freedom Center was beginning to flounder. Following the rush of new members fleeing cults in the wake of the Jonestown suicide, the Mills had used their power to extract funds and manipulate their workers and residents. Their grift dried up, though, when they started spending their money on new cars instead of paying their Freedom Center employees. After running the Human Freedom Center for about 2 years, the Mills abandoned it in mid-1980. Al, Jeannie, Eddie, and Defection all lived in a small bungalow in Berkeley. On one hand, while they'd spent years in the grips of occults and their anti-cult organization had collapsed, they were finally free from the looming threat of People's Temple vengeance. They were finally leaving their door unlocked at night. On the other hand, most of the people they'd lived with and loved for years were dead, and essentially all the children their kids had grown up with had been killed. Defection had been in the cult from age 5 to 11, and Eddie aged 6 to 12, and they just had no idea how to adjust to society. And while they'd put time and distance between themselves and their past, they didn't escape it.
Al and Jeannie Mills were members of the People's Temple cult who turned against the Reverend Jim Jones. That was before the ritualistic deaths of more than 900 cult members in Guyana in November 1978. Afterward, the Mills said they feared vengeance. Last night, someone killed them in their Berkeley, California home. Barry Peterson reports.
The bodies were found about 10 p.m. Authorities said there were no signs of forced entry, so the Mills may have known their killer. Investigators worked through the day hunting for clues, saying they knew of no motives. The youngest son, Eddie, was watching television in another part of the house when a relative discovered the bodies. He told police he saw and heard nothing.
Al Mills was shot and killed in his bedroom. Defection was shot in the head twice and died a few days later. Jeannie fled into the bathroom, but was shot to death through the locked door. Eddie, who had smoked a little weed and was watching TV in his bedroom, said he heard nothing. None of the neighbors heard anything either. The bodies were discovered when Jeannie's mom came over later that night. Immediately, suspicion went toward the People's Temple, but who was left to get vengeance on the Mills after the mass suicide event 18 months earlier? Was there really a People's Temple hit squad getting revenge on enemies of the cult even as late as 1980? After all, in his suicide attempt, Jim Jones had threatened the Mills by name.
Because we are not committing suicide, it's a revolutionary act. We can't go back, they won't leave us alone. They're now going back to tell more lies, which means more congressmen, and there's no way we can survive. He's responsible for it. He brought these people to us. He and Deanna Myrtle. But people in San Francisco will not be idle over this. They'll not take our death in vain, you know.
But nobody had any knowledge of temple survivors hunting down their enemies, and the police had no reason to think that to be the case. There was no breaking and entering, no witnesses, and no real evidence at the scene. But was it really possible that Eddie hadn't heard anything that night? By his own account, he'd had 1 or 2 hits of cheap weed, taken a shower, and gone to watch TV. In a home that small, how did he not hear at least 7 gunshots being fired? His stepfather was killed across the hall, and moments later, his sister was shot twice in the head. His mother then fled into the bathroom and locked the door. 4 shots were fired right outside Eddie's bedroom door, through the bathroom door, killing Eddie's mother. And somehow, he heard none of it. The .22 caliber pistol the Mills were killed with was a relatively quiet gun, but even so, it just seems impossible. The police tested Eddie for gunshot residue. He'd taken a shower, but they did find trace amounts on his arm, though it wasn't enough to charge him. They never found any convincing evidence to suggest that Eddie did or didn't do it. The gun was never found either. It didn't belong to the Mills, and it's unclear how Eddie could have gotten it or gotten rid of it. They never found any indication of cult involvement. Months turned into years, and they never had anything to go on. Since Al died first, Jeannie inherited all of his possessions, and then when she died moments later, her possessions passed to her next surviving relative, so Eddie stood to inherit an estimated $200,000. Eventually, Eddie moved to Japan to escape the controversy around the murders. He married and had 2 children, and 25 years after the killings, he brought his kids to the U.S. to visit his surviving relatives for the first time. When he landed in California, he was arrested for the murders, but released shortly after due to a lack of evidence. He immediately returned to Japan, where he presumably still lives, though I found no confirmation of his whereabouts after 2005. It's hard to know what to think about the murder of the Mills. We know that the People's Temple was ruthless, that they'd killed defectors before, and that Jones threatened the Mills in his death tape in 1978 by name. But when Jones and almost all the rest of the temple died, was there really anyone left to carry out the vengeance against the Mills? Who was still willing to kill for Jim Jones 18 months after his death, and why did we never see a trace of them again? And if it was a hit squad, why just leave Eddie in his bedroom? Eddie then seems like the only other suspect. He endured an extremely traumatic childhood, lived for years in fear that he'd be killed, and was raised by a narcissistic mother and father who subjected him to that abuse. And maybe that abuse he experienced was even greater than we know. But was his anger so terrible that he shot his father and sister in the head, then when his mother locked herself in the bathroom, shot through the door until she was dead too? I mean, it was a violent, prolonged struggle. After all those years, what could have made him snap like that? And where did he find and then lose that gun that killed him? Did he experience some latent indoctrination that Jones had instilled in him years earlier in his childhood? Or was it an altogether different motivation? Could it have been somebody else acting with Eddie's knowledge? Is it possible he's simply just entirely innocent? There's just enough of a hint of something else that it warrants mentioning. An unnamed friend of Defection told the police that he saw something that night, about half an hour before the bodies were discovered. 3 men, 2 wearing windbreakers and another in a trench coat, fleeing the Mills residence in a cream-colored vehicle driven by a 4th person. And around 9:30 p.m. that night, Al's daughter Linda said she got a phone call from an unknown woman saying, quote, "Jeannie and Al are dead. If I were you, I'd lock the door." End quote. The police didn't know what to do with either of those statements. Nobody else saw those men, and they never found out who Linda's caller was. Unless Eddie knows the truth and someday reveals it, we'll just never know. The death of the Mills family was brutal and tragic, but it was also far more complicated than the vision of innocents slain by cultists that Jeannie presented years earlier. The Mills were enemies of Jim Jones, but they also spent years complicit in his crimes. They'd spurred on the incident that sparked a mass killing despite knowing the risks, and they'd essentially formed a counter-cult of their own. For years, they had every reason to fear Jones's vengeance. But it was only when it seemed that the threat was gone that their past finally caught up to them. we're left with two equally bewildering theories. That they were killed by a mystery hitman or death squad that was never seen again, or that they were brutally executed by their own son.